pawn to d4, knight to f6, pawn to c4, pawn to e6, pawn to g3, pawn to d5, knight to f3, bishop to b4, bishop to d2, bishop to d6, bishop to g2, pawn to c6, knight to c3, king to g8, bishop to g5, pawn to h6, bishop to f6, queen to f6, queen to b3, knight to d7, king to g1, queen to e7, pawn to c5, bishop to c7, pawn to e4, pawn to b6, pawn to d5, pawn to d5, rook to e1, queen to f6, knight to d5, pawn to d5, queen to d5, rook to b8, pawn to c6, rook to d8, pawn to d7, bishop to d7, knight to e5, bishop to e6, queen to e4, bishop to e5, pawn to e5, queen to e7, queen to e3, rook to c8, bishop to e4, queen to c5, queen to c5, rook to c5, pawn to f4, pawn to g6, king to f2, pawn to a5, king to e3, pawn to a4, rook to c1, rook to b5, rook to c2, rook to b4, bishop to d3, pawn to h5, rook to d2, pawn to b5, pawn to a3, rook to b3, rook to c1, pawn to b4, pawn to b4, pawn to a3, pawn to a3, bishop to f5, rook to d1, rook to a3, pawn to b5, bishop to g4, rook to c1, bishop to f5, rook to d1, bishop to g4, rook to c1, bishop to f5, rook to d1,